My name is Stephanie, and I'm going to be reading Stowaway by John David Anderson. So this book is about a boy named Leo, and in his time period, basically, there's this really valuable mineral that's found under the Earth's crust, and it turns out it's the most rare mineral in the whole galaxy. So Earth falls under attack, and Leo ends up stranded and on a mercenary ship, and he basically has to be a stowaway on the ship and try to survive in the galaxy. So I chose this book because I'm a huge fan of the Ender's Game series, so this kind of gave me a similar feeling towards like the Ender's Game novels, so I thought it'd be interesting to read. So, Prologue, Chasing Ghosts. They were playing tag when the first torpedo hit. In the narrow hallways of the crew quarters, the clomping of their standard-issue coalition boots echoing down the corridors. Gareth chasing Leo, gaining, cornering him at a dead end, reaching out to make the tag, only to find his hand pass right through his brother's chest. Hologram. Again. Cheater. The holo flickered, the pre-recorded video of a sprinting Leo finally timing out, the illusion dissolving into pixelated bits. Leo laughed, and Gareth turned to see his brother in the flesh, standing right behind him. A moment's hesitation, muscles tensing, traded smiles. The one saying, "You'll pay for that," the other, "You'll have to catch me first." Then Leo turned and bolted back the way he came, Gareth launching himself in pursuit. Leo knew there was no way he could outrun his older brother. Gareth had been a middle school track star back on Earth, now a tall, wiry 17-year-old. It wasn't a matter of winning for Leo. It was a matter of holding out as long as possible. A question of survival. They played this game 100 times before. He turned a corner, headed towards the commissary, conscious of Gareth's feet pounding on the steel grating. Louder. Closer. Maybe if he could make it to the door, he could duck inside, find somewhere to hide, delay the inevitable. But he wasn't fast enough. Gareth's hand whipped out, grabbing Leo by the shoulder, not so much tagging him as lassoing him, pulling him to a stop. Gotcha. Leo spun around, hands on his knees, sucking in recycled air. You okay? Fine, Leo huffed, just catching my breath. You cheated again. I told you you aren't allowed to use that thing. That thing was Leo's watch, a gift his parents had given him years ago. A hybrid of human and Ikari technology, like so many things nowadays. It could be used as a data viewer and a communicator. It kept track of his vitals. His heartbeat was currently 142 beats per minute. It could tell you where it parked your car. Almost incidentally, it told time. But the watch's most advanced feature was its miniaturized holographic generator, capable of creating three-dimensional projections of pre-recorded vids. Like the one of Leo running, recorded with the express purpose of fooling his brother in games of tag or hide and go seek. The projections looked real enough until you got up close and could start to make out the digital imperfections. Their parents had given Gareth the same watch, but he'd lost his long ago, left somewhere in the house they grew up in, on the planet they'd left behind. Dad says technology is the tool that allows us to overcome our limitations and sets us free, Leo reminded his brother. Except you're not free. I still caught you. Because your legs are twice as long as mine. An exaggeration. At one time it might have been true, but a couple of growth spurts since they'd come on board and Leo was no longer the scrawny runt whose head fit underneath Gareth's armpit. Not so easy to boss around, though Gareth could still wrestle him to the ground and rip the watch from his wrist if he wanted. Not that he would. Leo knew Gareth would never hurt him. He just wanted to give Leo a hard time. That's what big brothers were for. That and pretty much everything else. Especially out here, on this ship, where Gareth was the only real friend he had. Besides, as long as they played nice, their father wouldn't interrupt to badger them about their studies. As important as it was to Calvin Fender that his two sons learned how to balance chemical equations or calculate the masses of nearby stars, it was more important that they got along. And chasing each other around the Beagle was always preferable to reading a chapter of galactic history. Leo's breathing finally evened out. He brushed the brown mop out of his eyes, his bangs hanging like curtains, in sore need of a trim. The Beagle didn't have a barbershop, just Leo's father, whose DIY haircuts often resulted in disaster. Cosmetology was one of the few things his father wasn't good at. You have to give me at least a 10-second head start, Leo said. And you have to count loud so I know when you go. Fine, 10 seconds, but seriously, no more cheating. If I catch you, you won't. Leo shot back with mock confidence. Right. Leo coiled, ready to sprint down the corridor as soon as his brother started counting, but Gareth never even made it to 1. The explosion nearly threw them off their feet as the beagle lurched sideways. Steel beams shuddered. Leo's ears rang. The lights blinked off, on, then off again, triggering the fluorescent yellow emergency lighting that ran along the floor. Leo put a hand on the wall to steady himself. His brother's eyes shone like moons. What was that? The question was answered with a second explosion, the ship quaking again. Every alarm screamed at once. Leo stumbled, falling into his brother's ready arms. From down the corridor he could hear the crew of the Beagle shouting to one another, although it was impossible to make out what they were saying. It was impossible to hear anything over the ship's wounded bleating until the captain's voice echoed over the comms. Attention, crew of the Beagle. We are under attack. Security personnel report to the bridge immediately. Engineering to the drive chamber. Leo looked up at his brother, still holding him tight. Did she just say we're under attack? Gareth nodded, then looked sideways, startled by the sound of boot heels clomping down the hall. Leo knew the sound. He'd learned to recognize the rhythm of his father's footfalls, like the sound of his brother's snoring or his mother's pensive sighs. Leo spied his father turning the corner, his eyes falling on him and Gareth, pressed together. Dr. Calvin Fender's face softened, then hardened again. He spoke in a whirlwind. What are you two doing out here? Didn't you hear what Captain Sato said? You need to hide. Hurry. Their father pointed to the nearest door, leading to an empty bunk room barely half the size of one of the Fenders shared. He hustled Gareth and Leo into a corner, his white lab coat flapping on both sides like broken wings. Leo could tell he was scared. He could see it in his father's eyes, even if he couldn't hear it in his voice. His father was seldom scared. Dr. Fender tipped over a metal desk, making a barrier, concealing the boys from anyone passing by the door. Stay right here. Do not move. Understand? What's going on? Leo asked. Are we really under attack? Is it pirates? Worse, their father said. Worse than pirates. The Djarik, Leo thought. And from the look on Gareth's face, he knew it too. They've knocked out our engines and navigation systems, Dr. Fender continued. Communications too. I believe they intend to board us. You mean they're coming on the ship? Leo felt his chest tighten, a coil wrapping tight, working its way up to his throat. He wheezed in a painful breath. Dad, I think he's about to have an attack, Gareth said. Dr. Fender bent over, patting down Leo's pockets. Leo reached for it as well, finding what he needed, fumbling with the cap of his inhaler, squeezing the trigger and hearing the familiar hiss of medicine, the cool sensation as it snaked his way into his lungs, loosening the noose. Leo took a shuddering breath. You're okay, his father whispered, hands on Leo's shoulders. It's okay. Just breathe. I'm right here. We're both right here. Leo closed his eyes and took in his father's voice, the hint of coffee on his father's breath, the feel of his father's hands, and for a moment he was somewhere safe. He imagined himself back at home. Home. Until another, smaller blast caused the ship to shiver again, bringing Leo back. In the corridor, even the emergency lights started to flicker. The Beagle was wounded, limping, its engines disabled. The Djarik were preparing to board. Dr. Fender leveled a finger at his son. Whatever happens, you two stay here, understand? Gareth, you're in charge. You keep your brother safe. I'll be back as soon as I can. Gareth nodded, but Leo reached out for his father's coat. Wait, where are you going? To engineering, to see if I can do something to help with the navigation system. Hopefully the security team can hold off the Djarik long enough for us to break free and make a jump. Stay here. Keep yourselves hidden. Dr. Fender gathered his sons in an embrace that lasted all of 10 hammering heartbeats. I love you both, more than anything. And then he was up and out the door, letting it whisper close behind him, leaving Leo and Gareth huddled together, trembling in the dark. Gareth? It's okay, Leo. I'm here. And Dad will come back. He's just going to get us out of this. Leo felt his brother's hand smoothing his hair, working his way from front to back. It was something he remembered their mother doing whenever they got sick, running her forked fingers through their sweaty bangs, softly blowing on their foreheads to cool them. Her breath always smelled like mint from the gum she chewed. Everything's all right, she would say. Everything's going to be just fine. He always believed her. But Leo knew it wasn't always true. Of all the things that could happen, of all the things that had happened, this was as bad as it could get. The Djarik were sworn enemies of the Coalition, a plague on the universe. brutal and bloodthirsty, with little care for humanity, or any species other than their own. They had no qualms attacking an unarmed ship, stripping it of its fuel and leaving it to drift, its crew to suffer and starve. Leo had heard all those stories, but he didn't need them to know the Giaric were capable of. He'd seen it firsthand. Leo tried to take deep breaths, but they still hitched and sputtered. What will they do if they find us? They won't find us, Gareth whispered. What will they do if they find Dad? Gareth didn't answer at first. Their father was one of the highest-ranking science officers in the Coalition. That alone made him valuable. Dad's smart, Gareth said at last, understating it by a mile. He'll think of something. A final explosion drew a whimper from Leo as the alarms abruptly shut off, making it easier to hear the muffled chaos from the other side of the door. Shouting, gun blasts, the Beagle's limited security forces making their stand against the Giaric boarding party. It didn't last long. Leo pressed even closer to his brother as the sounds of battle gave way to silence. The room was bathed in an eerie yellow glow that made the shadows loom large against the wall. He wanted to call out for their father. Why couldn't he have just stayed with them? Why did they have to leave him here, alone? Leo knew the answer, of course. Calvin Fender would do everything he could to save the ship, the crew, as many as possible. The silence was interrupted by voices from beyond the closed door. They weren't ones Leo recognized. They certainly weren't human. Gareth, what's happening? His brother clamped a hand over Leo's mouth, but a moment too late. The door slid open softly, and Leo nearly jumped, giving them away, but Gareth held him, both arms knotted around his chest. Leo peeked through a slit in the metal desk that provided their only cover and barely choked out his scream. It was one of them. He had seen them before, in pictures, vids, but never so close. Close enough to see the skin of diamond-shaped scales stitched together, hard as a sapphire but ashen gray in color. The ridge of spikes running along the jawline, mirroring the rows of serrated white teeth inside. The gill-like slits along their necks, rippling with each breath. Scalies, Lizzies, Grey Devils, the nicknames given to them by humans to degrade or diminish them, to make them seem less scary than they were. It didn't work. The Giaric giant, lidless black eyes swept the room. Like a spider's eyes, a glossy black mirror that gave away nothing, showed no sign of pity or fear. Soldier's spindly arms held its rifle at the ready. It was said that the Giaric were somewhat humanoid in shape, with their straight spines and short necks, their splayed, unwebbed fingers, their prominent skulls, but to Leo they looked as far from human as possible. The creature raised its chin, giving a sniff through two thin slits. Its eyes came to rest on the desk and on the two boys cowering behind it. It made a sound, a clicking from somewhere behind its pointed teeth. A warning, a call to others, or maybe just some note of satisfaction at having discovered such easy prey. Tag, you're it. Leo wondered if they should make a run for it, try to squeeze past the Giaric marauder, slip into the corridor, make their way to engineering, to Dad. But his limbs were stiff with fear. The Giaric's rifle swept across the room, those black, unblinking eyes reflecting everything in miniature. Leo thought of his mother, and a hot anger surged inside of him. The alien's head whipped sideways, the sound of more gunfire from farther down the hallway catching its attention. With another click of its tongue, it slipped back through the entry, leaving the door open, the brother still bunkered behind the desk. Leo felt his brother's breath on the back of his neck, the one Gareth had been holding. Okay, Gareth whispered. It's okay. He's gone. But he wasn't. He was out there somewhere. They were inside the ship. There was no safe place, no matter what Leo's father said. The brothers huddled in their shadowy corner for 5 minutes, 10, 30, their legs cramped, afraid to stand up to even activate the switch on the door, feeling the cold sweat stain their uniforms, twitching at every sound, until, at last, they heard their names being called. Gareth? Leo? This voice was familiar, though it wasn't the one Leo had been hoping for. We're in here, Gareth shouted. Leo pulled himself to his feet just as Captain Sato appeared in the doorway. She looked different from when he'd seen her earlier that day. Her normally tightly buttoned uniform hung loose on her shoulders, one of which supported a makeshift sling for her arm, a spot of crimson soaking through. Are you hurt? She asked. Leo shook his head. The Giaric? Are they... Gone, she finished. They took what they wanted and left. What they wanted. No doubt in Leo's mind what that could be. Potassium. More fuel for their fleets. The Beagle wasn't a military ship. It was a scientific research vessel. They didn't have any weaponry aside from what their small security force carried. Captain Sato was the most valuable officer on the ship. The only other passenger who was an even ranking member of the coalition was. Leo saw the look in the captain's eyes and felt a chasm instantly open inside him, a black hole forming at his center. He knew without even asking, knew by the twist in his gut, the tightness in his chest. Captain Sato didn't look away. "I'm sorry," she said, trying to steady her voice. "We tried to stop them. We did, but it was no use." Leo reached out for something to hold on to and found his brother's hand as his whole world crumbled. Again. Day after day, we stuck. We breathed the emotion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, 1798. Chapter 1. Better Than Nothing. The first time Leo saw an Icarian spaceship up close, he beat his pants. Just a little. It wasn't his fault. He'd warned his parents he needed to go. They had been driving for 2 hours already, headed to the California coast. At least one of the stretches that the steadily rising oceans hadn't reclaimed. When the soda cans and the cup holders started to rattle, a low growl creeping up behind them. Leo and his brother looked through the windshield, and that's when they saw it rumbling up behind them. An Ikari transport, gleaming silver, its hull glinting against the light of Earth's modest sun. Bigger than the football stadium, its belly bristled with gun emplacements. Even their transports were well armed. It soared directly over their heads, its sleek, shark-like shape casting a giant shadow along the road as it passed, its neon blue engines too bright to look at for long. Leo had seen them 100 times before, of course, but always on a screen and from a great distance. Never right above his head. Just the sight of it, so massive, so alien, and the sound of its sublight engines arcing through the sky caused Leo to lose it, a small white spot blossoming on the front of his shorts. His dad pulled over and told Leo to just finish in the bushes on the side of the road. Leo didn't even bother to look where he was aiming. His eyes were still turned skyward, taking in the alien vessel disappearing into the horizon. "Sorry," Leo said. "Don't worry about it. I almost did the same thing the first time I saw one up close," his father said. "Amazing, aren't they?" Calvin Fender's eyes were trained skyward as well, staring with equal bug-eyed wonder. "As a kid, I always imagined someone was out there, you know? And now, to see them, to be a part of it, man." Leo's dad shivered, then he pointed to the back of the ship. "See that bright orange ring back there? That's the FTL drive. That's the game changer. Without that, you and I wouldn't even be having this conversation because the Ikari would never have been able to find us to begin with." Leo's 6-year-old brain tried to wrap itself around everything his father was saying. "Where's it going?" "I don't know. It's a transport, so maybe it's dropping off supplies. Or maybe picking up volunteers." Even Leo knew that Icarian ships spent most of their time hovering high in the atmosphere or even further out in orbit. They seldom landed, except when they had something to give or something to take. Volunteers for what? Dr. Fender watched the ship shrink in the distance. "My guess is they are recruiting colonists, workers, miners, soldiers, pilots, anyone willing to help out." "Help out with what?" "Building the coalition," Leo's father said. "The coalition of planets. Don't they teach you about this stuff in kindergarten?" "I learned how to tie my shoes," Leo said. "Really?" Leo looked down to see his laces flapping free, but then he glanced over to see his father's shoelaces had come undone as well, so he didn't feel bad. When he looked back up, the Icarian transport was almost gone, though you could still hear its engines hum. "Will we ever go on a ship like that?" "I hope so," his father said. "I think it might be cool, don't you? Go out there, see new stars, new planets, new people. Besides, we might not have a choice." Actually, that all sounded a little frightening to Leo, especially if it was something he had to do. "You boys almost finished out there? Some of us prefer not to be in the bushes if we don't have to." Leo smiled at his mother and ran back to the car, gearing himself up for another hour stuck in the back seat with his brother. He looked one last time at the wide expanse of sky and the Icarian ship, now just a silver speck on the horizon. Someday, he thought, someday he'd go on one, go out there, like his father said, just to see what it's like, but certainly not for forever. He already knew that he would always want to come back home. You better eat that. Gareth pointed to the spongy gray slab with his fork. Leo stared with undisguised disgust at the lump on his plate. He could list the basic ingredients: synthetic protein compound, an injection of vitamins, some kind of emulsifier to hold it together, and a load of preservatives to make it last for 3 years in deep freeze. It was something cooked up in a government lab to keep spacefarers from starving, and it tasted like it. He and Gareth called it ficken. Admittedly, ficken nuggets were better one, but the ship's power supply had been rerouted to cover only essential functions, and heating up protein chunks was non-essential. Of course, this was the least of Leo's worries. It had been 4 days. 4 days since the Beagle was attacked by a Dejaric warship and left limping, stripped of all its fuel, floating in the middle of nowhere. Though to Leo, who'd been on board the ship for nearly 3 years, everywhere felt like the middle of nowhere. The Dejaric had taken everything they deemed valuable, leaving the crew with the ship's crippled and paralyzed remains. The crew -1. There had been coalition guards on board, engineers, navigators, the captain herself, and yet the Dejaric had taken only Leo's father. And it wasn't by chance. At least that's what Leo had gathered from the crew who tried to explain, who came to apologize, like Captain Sato, for not being able to stop them. Almost as if the Dejaric attacked the Beagle for the specific purpose of kidnapping his dad. Except nobody knew why. Or if they did, they weren't telling the 2 sons he left behind, arguing over their last chunk of ficken. "I'm serious. Eat it." "I don't want it," Leo said. The first 2 days after the attack, Leo refused to eat anything at all. He barely slept, every sound causing his pulse to quicken, flashes of his father's face in those last minutes, the too brief hug, that broken promise, "Be back as soon as I can." The Dejaric standing in the doorway, sniffing them out. The images spun around the carousel of his brain, haunting him and denying him sleep. Not that he could have slept for long. Not in the same room as his brother, who had woken up every hour thrashing so violently Leo was sure he would throw himself out of the top bunk and break something. As if they both weren't broken enough already. Even now, Leo still wasn't sure he could keep this meal down. But he also knew that what was left of the Beagle's food stores had been rationed, which meant no cold synthetic protein chicken should go to waste. But that still didn't mean Leo had to eat it. He slid his plate silently over to his brother. Gareth didn't look good. Dark half-moon sagged under his eyes, and his hair had taken on a greasy sheen. Somehow he looked thinner to Leo already, and they both smelled ripe, layers of new sweat overlapping the old. Like warm food, warm showers were non-essential, and the cold ones stung, so Leo avoided them. He changed clothes only out of habit. He could feel the fuzz forming along the edges of his gums. He'd brushed his teeth once in 4 days. After all, his father wasn't around to tell him to. There didn't seem to be much point. Gareth considered the meal plate with its one remaining morsel of food for a moment, before frowning and sliding it back. "I told you I don't want it," Leo said. "Yeah, but what would Dad say if he found out I ate half of your rations?" "What would he say?" Knowing their father, he would tell them both to keep their strength up. He would tell them to carry on, to use their heads, to not give up hope. Of course, if he were here, Leo wouldn't have the second hole inside him. Leo pushed the plate back. "I'm not eating it," he said. "It tastes like Ikari turds." "How would you know what Ikari turds taste like?" Gareth countered. "Well, it smells like them." Truthfully, Leo had never smelled one either. He'd never even seen an Ikari do its personal business. He just assumed it smelled. Just because you've perfected faster than light speed travel doesn't mean your food doesn't stink, does it? "Just eat it, please. It's good for you. It contains 27 essential vitamins and nutrients," Gareth said, reading off the recyclable container the nuggets came in. "Chicken flavored," it said. Leo honestly couldn't be sure if it was or not. He couldn't remember what real chicken was supposed to taste like. Forget it. Eat it. I'm older and you have to do what I say. That's not a rule. They pushed the metal plate back and forth between them until Leo pushed a little too forcefully, causing it to slide off the table, its chicken-flavored cargo bouncing across the steel floor. The brothers stared at it guiltily for a moment. Then Gareth recovered it and put it back on the plate, using the edge of his fork to painstakingly saw it in two. Leo got the bigger half. The rationing had started the day after the Dejarik attack. As soon as the diagnostics were finished and the captain had a full damage report, she had gathered all ship personnel onto the bridge to give them the news. I won't lie to you, Captain Seda began, looking over her bedraggled crew. The Beagle took a serious beating. Our life support systems are mostly intact. Oxygenator, water filtration, gravity generator. We're all still breathing and our feet are on the ground, but that's it for the good news. The ship's propulsion systems are damaged beyond repair, so unless someone can go out there and give us a push, we aren't moving. The jump drive is also not operational. Not that it matters since the Dejarik took all of our V. We have no weapons, no defenses, and no comms, which means we're basically sitting ducks. What about the shuttle? A member of the crew asked. The 6-passenger Lockheed landing craft that was supposed to be used for planetary surface exploration, but mostly gathered dust in the bigger ship's landing bay. There had been little need to study the surface of planets because, despite being out here for nearly 3 years, the Beagle had found little worth in studying. Its primary mission, Dr. Calvin Fender's primary mission, to discover and analyze more potential sources of Ventasium, had yielded little in the way of results. And yet it had somehow attracted the enemy's attention. I'm afraid the Dejarik sabotaged the shuttle as well. They made sure none of us were getting off the ship, Captain Sato said. Not none of us, Leo thought, a surge of sour bile burning the back of his throat. One of us was escorted off at gunpoint. Our best hope is that the Coalition realizes that we haven't checked in and are off the grid and sends a rescue team sooner rather than later. Either that or a friendly ship just happens to pass in range of our emergency beacon, which, given our location, is unlikely, but not impossible. In the meantime, we are doing our best to get the long-range communications back up and running. The sooner we do that, the sooner we can get help. And what about Dr. Fender? Leo traced Lieutenant Berg's voice, spotting her in the crowd. She was the only member of the Beagle security detail he ever talked to. The rest nodded to Leo in the corridors or gave him a mock salute. But Lieutenant Berg was different. She showed him card tricks and slipped him extra packets of cocoa to mix with his powdered milk. She'd been there when the Dejarik took Leo's dad. She tried to stop them, as the bandages across her head could attest to. But a handful of Coalition security guards were no match against a squad of Dejarik marauders. Captain Sato's eyes darted to Leo and his brother just for a moment, then focused back on the crew. We still aren't sure why Dr. Fender was taken, but as soon as communications are back up, we will inform the Coalition of his capture. Until then, we will do what he would expect us to and look after each other. That, and pray for a safe return. In other words, the captain seemed to be saying, there's nothing we can do. They were helpless, stranded, lost. Suddenly, Leo felt like he was going to be sick. Hey, where are you going? Gareth hissed, reaching out and grabbing for his brother's shoulder. But Leo brushed him off and bolted from the bridge. For once, Gareth didn't bother to chase him. Leo wandered the silent corridors, taking the evidence of the battle. The scars of laser fire scorched along the walls, the hiss of steam from pipes that had yet to be repaired, and made his way down to the engineering level, where he could hear the clanging and cursing of someone at work. Someone who, like Leo, was skipping out on Captain Sato's somber status report. The devils take you, you bowel-crusted, feces-eating snarf sucker. The cursing Leo recognized, even if his translator struggled with some of the words. The nanochip embedded in his skull was remarkable. A piece of Icarian technology to nearly rival their coveted drive jump. But it wasn't 100% accurate or exhaustive. Leo didn't really need to know what a snarf was, though, to get the overall meaning. Leo moved past the entrance of the engine room and felt the temperature instantly jump. Standing inside with his shirt off, his skin glistening, his coils of long black hair stuck to his back, the ship's chief engineer was busy smashing some contorted hunk of metal with a wrench, mangling it ever further. "Explode your anus 1,000 times," he said, tossing the wrench to the ground where it spun nearly to Leo's feet. "Oh, sorry, Leo," Tex said, wiping his hands on his pants. "I didn't know you were there." Leo shrugged. He'd heard much worse. Much of it from the alien currently apologizing. Texarkhodus was an Edrin, from a planet orbiting a star not far from the one Leo's house used to circle, relatively speaking. In addition to being a gifted swearer, he was also a talented tinkerer, and once Leo got over the fact that he had blue skin, 3 eyes, and a quick temper, Leo started volunteering to help with simple repairs, learning the ins and outs of ship maintenance from its primary caretaker. Tex, as he reluctantly allowed himself to be called, was the only alien Leo had ever befriended, or tried to. Leo wasn't sure the alien really had any friends. It couldn't be easy being the only one of his kind on board. Tex wiped his forehead with a rag that dangled from his tool stash and closed his eyes for a moment. He opened the middle one and fixed it on Leo. "How come you aren't on the bridge with the rest of the crew?" Leo shrugged again. "I'd heard enough," he muttered. "So she told you all about our situation?" "She said we were pretty much stuck here until we get rescued." "She said 'till,'" Tex said with a snort. "How optimistic." "You don't think the Coalition will come and rescue us?" Leo asked. "Oh, I think they'll try, but good luck finding us without any communication systems. Might have a better chance finding a single narp in the hide of a Hoshardian Torblat." Leo's translator struggled with half the sentence, but again, the meaning was clear. The Beagle's chief engineer didn't like their odds of getting rescued. "Ships get stranded all the time," Tex continued. "I used to be a scavenger, you know, back before my people were invited into the Coalition. We'd find wrecks littered across the void and break them down for scrap. Some were abandoned, others not." "And the people on board?" Leo asked. "Sometimes you find them alive," Tex said. "Others not. Of course it's possible I can get this blasted hunk moving again, but I wouldn't bet on it. Not without new parts. The Dejarik were thorough in, how do you humans say it? Tearing us a new one?" The Beagle's chief engineer slumped, sliding his broad shoulder back against the same piece of mangled machinery he'd been beating on before. Leo went and sat down across from him. He could see the patches of white skin along the Ediran's forearms. Burns. Some steam, some chemical, some ages old, others newly healed. Tex knew things, had seen things. His people had been attacked by the Dejarik as well, their planet bombarded, invaded. The Ikari finding them, inviting them into the Coalition. It had saved them, had saved their world. The engineer had told Leo stories of the battle's rage on Endiran soil, the Ikari and Dejarik filling the skies with fire, fighting over the most valuable substance in the universe, buried deep below his planet's surface. Ventasium. That was humanity's name for it. Even in English he had others. Hyperblast, fairy dust, jump juice. But Leo's father had always insisted on calling it by its scientific name, after the Italian scientist who had discovered it on Earth. Except Enrico Ventasi had no idea what he was really looking at when he pulled that chunk of radioactive rock from deep within Earth's crust. Couldn't comprehend the nature of the door he'd just unlocked. He wouldn't know until 2 years later, when the Ikari made first contact, telling the 9 billion people of Earth that they were far from alone in the universe, and that because of their Ventasium deposits, they were also one of the richest planets in the galaxy, which also made them targets, just like the planet of Adir. Like Leo, Tex had seen firsthand what the Dejarik were capable of, long before 2 Dejarik torpedoes slammed into the Beagle's hull. He had every reason to be pessimistic. And yet, "He's still alive, you know," the Adiran said, taking on Leo with his 3 unblinking eyes. "What?" "Your father, Dr. Fender. He's still alive. I may be Adiran, but you humans are too hard to read. I can see it painted on your face. You fear the worst, but it hasn't happened." How can you be so sure? Leo asked. Because if they'd wanted him dead, Tex offered, they would have just left him here with us. Leo tried to keep that flicker of hope burning as he stared at the half chunk of chicken recently rescued from the floor, doubting it would make it take it any worse. He shoveled the whole thing into his mouth, somehow choking it down. Gareth reached across and ruffled his hair. That wasn't so bad, was it? Compared to what? Compared to everything else they'd already been through? No. At least the food he could swallow. There's talk of trying to repair the shuttle, Gareth said, eating his half in nibbles as if trying to make it last. Sato thinks that if they salvage enough parts from the Beagle, they might make it flight-worthy. Then, if they could find a way to power it, then 6 of us would be able to get off this wreck, Leo said, doing the math, leaving the other 30 or so behind. Not behind, Gareth corrected. Whoever takes the shuttle would try and get help. Or just get stranded in another part of space. It's worth a shot, Gareth snapped. It's better than sitting around here doing nothing. Leo stared at his now empty plate. He hadn't meant to make his brother mad. Gareth was right. It was better than just sitting here, waiting to see if the food or the power supply ran out first, or if the damaged hull would just split at the seams, sucking all the oxygen out into the void. They were barely staying afloat out here, and Leo knew it. They all knew it. If only Dad were here, Leo thought. He would know what to do. Gareth put his fork down, leaning across the table to get Leo's attention. Hey. Leo lifted his chin, just a little. Listen to me. We're going to get out of this. I'm going to find a way to keep you safe. Do you understand? Gareth reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a silver foil wrapper. Leo instantly recognized it by the shape. I thought there wasn't any more, he said. I thought so too, Gareth answered. But I helped Officer Ridley patch up some ducks this morning, and he gave it to me. He slowly peeled back the silver foil, revealing the precious hunk of chocolate underneath, only slightly discolored around the edges. It'll get the taste of ficken out of our mouths, at least. Leo watched Gareth take the chocolate between his fingers, ready to snap it in two, when the sound of boots in the corridor outside the mess hall made them both freeze. He followed his brother to the door to see members of the Beagle's crew running toward the bridge. What's going on? Gareth asked. A ship, a voice called back. We spotted another ship. It's coming our way. Dejari? Leo guessed, hoping he was wrong. I don't think so. Coalition? Gareth called out, but he got no response. Leo looked up at his brother. Gareth's wide eyes were a perfect match for his own. They were both thinking the same thing. They were saved. The pirates of today are not so different from the romanticized figures from our own sordid human history, the Blackbeards and Captain Kidds. Yes, they pilot spaceships instead of schooners, fire torpedoes instead of cannonballs, wield energy blasters instead of flintlocks, but they are still misfits and miscreants resorting to thievery and violence in their quest for fame and fortune, or simply as a way to survive. Dr. Jeffrey Harmon, Scurvy Dogs in Outer Space, Piracy in the Modern Age, 2053.